Chapter 1. The Crescent. It was a bank holiday weekend and a gloriously warm Sunday morning that morning of August 25th, 1991 in Middlesbrough. I'll never forget it. I was 11 years old and only a week or two from going to St Anthony's in Town Farm, Middlesbrough, which was my local secondary school. The reason I'll never forget that day, 27 years ago, was because of a conversation I had with an older lad at the bottom of my street, Keysden Close in Berwick Hills. He must have been around 17 or 18 at the time, and I only knew him as Hamo, although I believe Craig Hamilton was his real name. I was just setting off from home to play football on the old Vic Field, and as I walked past his house, he told me the devastating news. Lee Duffy was killed last night. Craig looked like he was in sheer disbelief, and it seemed like he was telling me this not because he was gossiping, but because he had to say it out loud for it to be true. He had a look of devastation and amazement in equal measure on his face. I couldn't believe it either. The news was like I imagined it would be if the Queen had been pronounced dead. Well, the truth is, I didn't know Lee Duffy. I'd never met him in my life, and I'm almost sure that Hamo hadn't met him either. But everybody, and I mean everybody and their dog, had heard of the Duff. In reality, I was an 11-year-old boy. The only thing I was interested in at the time was Celtic FC and WWF wrestling, so why did I feel so shocked and saddened that some guy I'd only ever seen in the Gazette, a Middlesbrough paper, for doing naughty things, was dead? I think the reason was that although I'd never met Lee Duffy, I'd been hearing his name since I was around 8 years old. I believed in Father Christmas till I was 9, so to be frank, I'd known of the Duff before I knew that fairy tales weren't true, like a lot of kids in Middlesbrough. Kids used to talk about him in my primary school like he was some kind of hero, so I imagined him to be 8 foot tall and looking a bit like Batman. Like I said, I'd known of Lee Paul Duffy for a good few years before that strange summer's morning in August. The reason I'd heard so much of the man who everybody in my town spoke of in awe was because I hung around with a lot of lads who were older than me. When I was growing up, I was football mad and would play daily on the old Vic Field. Quite often, just to get a kick about, I'd join in playing with lads 5, 6 or 7 years older than me. Of course, there was no internet in them days. It was either a game of knocky ido, a game of footy, or you twiddled your thumbs. There were so many times when I'd hear the older boys' second-hand gossip about this man, who in my mind was almost superhero-like. I would often crick me neck to listen to these tales, which would spread across the town of Middlesbrough like the Great Fire of London. Of course, boys'll be boys, and often many of the lads telling the stories would say they knew Lee really well, or had met him at some point. I heard so many tales of Lee, which are now embedded in Teesside folklore forevermore. I can clearly remember the tale of when he was shot in the foot at a late-night blues party on Princess Road. The story I would hear as a 10-year-old boy was that Lee was shot in the foot and chased the culprits down Newport Road in Middlesbrough town centre, which was a full mile long. When in fact, Lee was found in the old Rooney's bar doorway, now the Oak, by 2 police officers. So in reality it was a case of Chinese whispers, but I had him down as some kind of fucking Terminator, like out of the second film that was out at the time. Another film out at the time was Steven Seagal's Out for Justice, which is about a man on a one-man mission who goes searching to pay back the people who wronged him, just like Lee Duffy did. I can really remember when Lee was the man about town, and the stories I would hear about him. On one hand, I would think this man is the hardest man in Middlesbrough with special powers, but I can also recall clearly feeling sorry for this poor man who everybody was out to kill. I'll never forget the strange feeling that was there in the town on that day and for days after for as long as I live. It didn't matter who I spoke to or where I went, Middlesbrough was in a state of shock, and a black cloud hung over it for a while. Nothing has ever come close to that feeling in Middlesbrough since then. Over the years, I myself don't mind admitting that I've become greatly fascinated with the life of Lee Paul Duffy. as of a lot of people, whether they like to admit it or not. Who was he? What was he really about? Was he as bad as the tabloids have made him out to be for over a quarter of a century? Surely he was still just a kid at 26, wasn't he? I must admit, it took me around 5 or 6 months of haggling with my senses to do this book. As much as Lee's life intrigued me, I had my doubts that maybe this one was a little too close to home. I mean, I grew up under the smug of Middlesbrough, and the last thing I wanted to do was kick a hornet's nest, as I'd had experience of doing just that when I wrote the 2 books about Paul Sykes from Wakefield. They were written in a similar style to this one. I like the reader to be presented with a balanced view of the good and bad and leave them to make their own minds up. To several people in Wakefield, well, I'm not their favourite person, to say the least. Think of when Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses in 1988, which provoked protests, and he had contracts put out on his life. Well, I had a similar experience. Although I've been called a few unpleasantries and had the odd death threat or 2 over it, I was told by his sister that he'd have loved books being written about him. Similarly, I've been told that Lee predicted a book about himself, saying, "They'll write books about me one day." I can't say if he'd be pleased about it or not. Who knows what he'd be thinking at 53 years old? Would he have turned his life around? We'll never know. Anyway, it was all very well causing such a stir in a place 60-odd miles away, but for me to do it in my hometown, a place some members of my family still live to this day, took some real consideration. The reality of it was that it wasn't really until I'd spent a bit of time with one of Lee's closest friends and he said to me that he actually thought it was a good idea to do the Duff story that I decided to write it. I only half-heartedly put it to him, as more than half of me wanted him to tell me it really wasn't a great idea and then I could have forgotten about it. But he replied saying, "If you do it, you need to make sure you do this one properly, Jamie." He was referring to the previous books which had been written about Lee, which, on having read them twice, I can see his point as to why he was annoyed by a few things in them. I'd like to clarify that whatever people in this book have said about Lee, I've had no control over. Like I've said and will always say, I didn't know him and had never met him. I've just tried to get a balanced view. I can't make him look like Mother Teresa, and I haven't influenced anyone in any way, whether they loved Lee or said he epitomised everything evil. I certainly have no axe to grind with any of the Duffy family in bringing this book to Teesside, and I understand their mistrust, as there's been so many inaccuracies printed about him and things said that have been taken out of context. I don't think there's anything clever about being a bully or how Lee Duffy went about his business, but also I don't think there's anything clever about a man who just turned 26 by 2 months losing his life. I'll speak from the heart and say the biggest thing that jumps out at me when I look over the life of Lee Duffy is that it was an absolute tragedy. I've heard the monster stories of Lee, the vicious brute who revelled in his acts of violence, the fear he would instill into the people of Teesside, but in truth, we're talking about a 26-year-old kid here. I'll speak from my own experience, and I'm sure you'll relate that each and every one of us have all been through bad periods, but have come through our troubled phases to regain normality. When I make my point here, I'd like to use my friend Graham Seed as an example, if I may, for a moment. What I mean is that Graham lived the life of a thug, football hooligan, thief, bully, alcoholic, and did more porridge than Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and that was just his good points. He served 13 different prison sentences because he liked it that much. By his own admission, he was the biggest scumbag to have ever walked the town of Middlesbrough, and many of you, if you can remember Graham in the early 90s, will be nodding your head in agreement when reading this. Graham's struggle has been well documented in Teesside, and he had got to the point where he even lived on the streets for a couple of years, and he had to drink 21 litres of white lightning a day to even function. Well, in 1996, Graham slipped into a coma due to the life he was leading, and even a priest came and read him his last rites. His own mother, Pat, was advised to give the hospital permission to turn his life support machine off. At that time, Big Gram, who's around 6'5", had been a thorn in Middlesbrough town centre's side for a few years. You name it, if there was an element of antisocial behaviour about it, then Gram's seed was at the centre of it. Normally it'd be for thieving or beating somebody up, but his modus operandi varied. There's a story Gram told me himself about one of the priests in Middlesbrough who said that the only miracle he had ever witnessed was when Gram went to his church to ask for money with his arm in pot, saying it was broken. The priest took pity on Gram and handed over the cash, only to see him again that day without so much as a broken finger. Gram had spent the money on another 2 litres of cider, and his attitude was, another one bites the dust, and off he'd go to con the next poor gullible soul who'd buy his crap. But going back to Gram's lifeless body in a coma, believe me when I say that the whole of the town of Middlesbrough's opinion on Gram's near-death state was to say, good riddance to bad rubbish, why has it taken so long? Now, I'm not saying Lee Duffy was as big a scumbag as Gram Seed was, nor am I trying to say Gram was anywhere in the same league as Lee Duffy. What I'm saying is Gram Seed didn't turn his life around till he was 32. That's 6 years older than Lee Duffy ever was. Gram has turned his life around and has spent the last 22 years of his life dedicating it to helping people through his church sowing seeds in Stockton. I'm not saying Lee Duffy would have found Jesus and lived happily ever after, but even Lee's close friend, who I won't name, told me that Lee had told him many times that he wanted out of the seedy, brutal Teesside underworld of which he was the undisputed top dog. Even Lee's girlfriend at the time has said before that she saw Lee break down uncontrollably many times because everywhere he went people were out to try and kill him. Lee was saying he wanted to get away from the life he'd built up for himself over the previous 8 years, live the quiet life and bring his baby daughter up with his girlfriend and be around for his other children. I'm not making excuses for Lee's behaviour by any means, but when the only thing you've known all your life is extreme violence at the drop of a hat or having to fight out of the roughest area in one of the most working class towns around, it would make it that bit harder for him to say, do you know what? I don't want to do this anymore, please. I'd rather not fight tonight and walk away. But there were certain individuals who wouldn't have allowed him to do that. I haven't become a top psychologist since researching Lee's life, but when you led the life that Lee did, and considering his upbringing, I don't think he would have had the tools socially to adapt to a new life without something catastrophic happening. Maybe if Lee had survived the fatal attempt on his life that night, maybe things might have fallen into place for him and allowed him to change. Remember, it took my friend until he was read the last rites to change. Only Lee's closest family will have the answers as to whether he would have had it in him to change had he survived in the early hours of that fateful morning. The opinion of many people that were in his circle was that if Lee hadn't passed that day, then he wouldn't have survived long after it. People have laughed at the mere mention of Lee changing, as they've said he loved the way he was and what his life was about, and that the only thing that would end his reign of terror would be his death. But I have to wonder how much of that was the real Lee, and how much of it was a macho front that he felt he had to play out every day of his life unless he was in the safety of his home. In the summer of 2006, I'd be put on a labouring job for a good few months. I'd end up working on Gilbrook School in Eston, which incidentally is next door to the final resting place of Lee Duffy. At the time, I would have an hour for my lunch, and as it took me 10 minutes to eat the pack-up that the wife would do me, it left me a lot of time to sit in a bait cabin talking about football to hairy-ass builders. I mentioned that I was reading The Taxman's, aka Brian Cockerill's book at the time, and one of the lads said, his mate Lee Duffy is buried right in the corner of Eston Cemetery at the back. It's under a camera as it's been vandalised so many times you can't miss it. He also went on to tell me that before Lee was buried, there were rumours he was going to be concreted in, as there were serious threats made that he was going to be dug up. How abhorrent that Lee's family had to deal with situations like that after they had lost him. It's beyond words how sick some people are. Me being my inquisitive self and growing up hearing all the stories of Lee, I went along one dinner time to visit Lee's grave. Walking in the cemetery, I noticed Middlesbrough footballing legend and fellow South Bank boy Wilf Mannisson's grave, who'd passed 6 years earlier in 2000. When I got to Lee's grave, I was struck with a real sense of sadness. His grave was surrounded by all these graves of people who'd passed away in old age, and Lee was only 26. One of the most bizarre things on that day, which was uncanny, was when I looked at his tombstone, which said the words of his favourite song by Little Caesar, but written by the Waterboys in 1985. They saw the crescent, he saw the whole of the moon. It suddenly dawned on me that Lee was exactly 26 years, 2 months and 2 weeks to the day when he passed. That day I was at his grave, I was a couple of days off from being 26 years old, 2 months and 2 weeks myself. As I looked at the grave of this man who I'd never met, it hit me just how young this fella was. He'd already been past 15 years by then. I started thinking of all the stupid shit I was doing at that point in my life. So you see, you can agree with the hordes of stories of his wickedness that are linked to Lee Duffy forever. Even the ones he may never have done. What did it matter, because he's dead, and we'll believe it anyway? Or you can think a bit deeper, and think of the word empathy. It's a word which doesn't really come to anybody in life until you're a little more well-balanced and grown up. I must admit, sometimes I don't even look at situations in life that come my way with empathy. Empathy is a tool which lets you look at the full picture, but then understands and looks at it from both points of view and asks questions of us like why he behaved the way he did later in life. They do say that in every action there's a reaction. So for everybody who's taken the stance of, well, he was a fucking bully who got what he deserved, even though they may not have known him personally, remember that there's only one person who can judge us all, and that will be when our day of judgment comes. What I will say for the record, and let me just put my shrink hat on for a minute, Lee had a troublesome childhood, there's no denying that. But in my opinion, what really stayed with him until his dying day was the horrific extent of the bullying he suffered in his younger days and the sheer determination that no one, and I mean no one, would ever bully him again. I'm sure there's people far more qualified than me to go on record and say the bullied become the bullies. Lee was even asking friends to pull over in his adult life so he could go fill someone in the middle of the street as he'd seen a person who used to bully him maybe 12, 15 years earlier. He just never recovered mentally. It wasn't only other older children who bullied the younger Lee on the tough streets of South Bank. I've heard Lee's brother speaking on YouTube at the times in their early years when Lee's father, Laurie, was abusive in the home under the influence of alcohol. In one of my other books, I can recall East End hardman Dominic Negus saying to me, I grew up looking up to Lenny McLean and Roy Shaw, so was I ever going to turn out different? And I can understand where he's coming from on that. Of course, someone Lee looked up to was his Uncle Rod, who was a professional criminal. Lee idolised him and wanted to be just like him. Maybe because of the start Lee Paul Duffy had, he was never going to end up any different. I've no doubt in my mind that Lee Duffy could have been a decent fighter had he stuck to boxing, if only he'd chosen that path instead. I've spoken to people around the Middlesbrough boxing scene who've told me Lee Duffy was blessed and was the perfect cruiserweight, but Lee lacked the patience required to be a champion fighter, because he was over-eager to go all out and gung-ho, to quote Joe Walton's boxing coach Eddie O'Donoghue. Lee was just a knockout machine and not Ed's type of fighter, but he did acknowledge his boxing quality. Another funny thing that happened to me was when I was still in two minds as to whether to do this book or not, and I was waiting to hear back from some of Lee's close friends to put me at ease with their backing, I must have heard The Whole of the Moon on the radio a good 5 or 6 times in the matter of a couple of weeks. I took that as a sign that I was being given the green light. Lee used to say that the reason he loved that song so much was because it reminded him of his life. When you hear the lyrics of "You climbed on that ladder and you came like a comet blazing your trail too high, too far, too soon. You can relate to what Lee was saying, 'cause he climbed on that ladder and got to a place in life when it was too far and too soon for him. One of the most surreal things that I heard was when I met up with Lee's biological son. He told me that he had married recently, and that song came on the radio right before he left for the church. It was the last song he heard before becoming a married man. It was almost as if Lee was sending a message to his boy to let him know that he was with him on the most important day of his life. I'd say at least 70% of the people in Middlesbrough think only of one man when they hear of the title of this book. Many years ago, when I myself was growing up and started going out drinking in 96, 97, I put that song on the jukebox in my old haunts like the Eagle or Newcastle House in Berwick Hills. All the locals would say that it was Lee Duffy's song. Remember, Lee was 26 when he died, but he'd been doing things that he probably shouldn't have since he was just a skinny kid of 18 years old, putting it on the toes of 35-year-old mature men with big names in the town. Lee Paul Duffy paid the ultimate price, and he's been dead now longer than he was alive. When I finally decided to do this book, and spoke with Lee's friend in his home around Christmas 2017, I gave him my word that it would be done right. I wanted to go and find people who knew Lee, or who were around him through the various stages of his life. No disrespect to any of the other books from any Newcastle contingent, but I wanted this book to be something that hadn't already been done. That was to write a book purely on how the good folk of Teesside saw their most infamous son. This book is the voice of the Middlesbrough people for the very first time regarding Lee Paul Duffy. Forget what you've heard in the past and judge him by the people who really knew Lee for good or bad. I've been told so many things regarding Lee Duffy the last couple of months. You will read in here stories of his violence, but there are ones of the other side of Lee Duffy, the Lee Duffy who had a generous heart. So much so that when complimented on his new black leather jacket by Frankie Barn Poynton in Kensington Road Blues, he took it off his back and gave it to Frankie. A 700 quid jacket. He was just this crazy one-off, and I've been in awe at many of the things he used to get up to, sometimes in a good way, but at times in shock. I've heard tales of Lee playing a game with Brian Cockerill on who would smash the most car windows in one go with your fist. Brian did 17 and Lee managed to go one better and do 18. Then, because Brian had been beaten, Brian then picked up the last car and moved it onto the pavement, so you could say their relationship was a competitive one. There's also the stories of when 3 of Lee's friends went to visit him in Durham prison. When they turned up, they were told that Lee wasn't allowed in the usual visitors' hall with the other prisoners and that he had to have his visit in the block. Basically the prison inside of the prison, where the worst of the worst are kept, like Paul Sykes and Fred the Head Mills, etc. All the way through that visit, Lee had a joint behind his ear while smoking another. That just doesn't happen in British prisons usually. The only time, I was told, that Lee met his prison rival for the alpha male title was in the Havana a few months before he died. Paul Sykes, who will have been 45 then, was brought to Middlesbrough by Tony Spenceley for a night out, and Paul went to shake the Duff's hand. Lee put his back to Sykes and continued dancing and said, "Who does he think he is, me?" whilst laughing. Lee was very childlike like that, a few of his friends have told me. Lee once looked after Brian Charrington, the international drug dealer, whilst they were inside prison. When Lee got out, Brian gave Lee a $7,000 Rolex as a thank you. It is true, Lee stopped a lot of people in Middlesbrough selling drugs, and people were then having to go to places like Manchester just to get him. Lee didn't capitalise on the void by selling the stuff himself, as I'm told that Lee couldn't run a bath. When Lee did have big bags of ecstasy, he would eat most of them himself, sometimes being on them for days on end in Newcastle and other places he would flee to live the party lifestyle he so loved.
Sometimes Lee would get by on 2 hours sleep a night because he was partying that much. One of Lee's close friends told me that a book could have been written about each day of Lee's life as he was up to that much. In fact, one of Lee's favourite sayings was, "You can put this in a book when I'm gone." Lee spoke all the time about his death, and he had an instinct that he wouldn't make old bones. Anyone close to Lee will know that. He predicted also that one day someone would write a book on him. There have been several books touching on his life while writing about other people, so I suppose this is the only one that is solely about Lee, but I hope this one will be the most balanced one. Another time, Lee offered his best friend a huge amount of money just so he'd stay out with him another night after they'd been out 2 days already smoking dope up Eston Hills. I asked one of his closest friends what Lee was like as a kid, to which his reply was, "Lee Duffy was never a kid. Even at 15 he was like a man. On one side of Lee, you've got this big monster of a man who looked the part and was capable of battering people. Then, on the other hand, you've got this big, cumbersome kid who was still childlike and still very damaged from the abuse he suffered years before." It is true that when Lee was in prison, he would seek out the hardest in the place and want to take over. In Walton Prison, Lee went on the exercise yard and demanded to know who the top man was. I have it on good authority that the Scousers were petrified of him, and Lee was even more violent inside prison because there were no weapons inside or any risk of him being shot. Even men in their gangs didn't want to tackle the Duff, and I'll quote my source, "He knocked them all dead as a nit." Lee was an extra bad lad in jail. Not many people realise that Lee and Davy Allo did time together in Walton Prison, and after Davy got out, he even ran Lee's girlfriend back on a visit. Yes, Lee and Allo had been friends, as much as you could be friends with Lee, as I've been told that even if he classed you as a friend, you still had to be on your guard with him. Allo got on with Lee at times, that is true, but I've been told that the bad blood started because he wouldn't bow to Lee, and Lee wasn't having that. It's well known in Middlesbrough that Allo was a staunch man who would have a do with anyone. The fact was, Lee and Allo came to blows on 3 separate occasions. Once in the Blazes foyer, while scuffling, it is said that Allo was seen to be getting the better of him, as they'd fallen and Allo had landed on top of Lee. Then at the law courts, Lee had been in a car with a friend and saw Allo and told his mate to pull over and asked him to watch his back as Allo was with a couple of mates drinking. Lee approached Allo and said, "I hear you've been looking for me," and from there it quickly escalated into them trading blows, Lee getting the better of Allo that time. Then, the last time, well, everyone knows how that ended. The real bad feeling between them two really started at John Graham's wedding just a couple of months before their last confrontation outside the Western and Afro-Caribbean Centre on Martin Road. I've been told one of Lee's party tricks was to let the people whose company he was in drink fast while Lee poured his drinks out. Brian Jaffrey caught Lee doing that a few times, spitting his drinks out on the pub carpet. People close to Lee have told me that Lee never used to relax. He never sat down and watched the TV and switched off from the outside world, and that he lived his life at 100 miles per hour every single day. Another thing Lee wouldn't do is sleep in the same house for more than one consecutive night. He would regularly sleep at different houses all over Middlesbrough. One guy, who was close to Lee, said that he often said his ambition in life was to kill a man with his bare hands by the time he was 30 years old. The same source told me that Lee used to say that by the time they were 30, Joe Livingston, David Allison or himself would be dead. The prisons couldn't contain him, and that's why he ended up in 22 different prisons during the 26 months of the 4-year sentence he served, because they'd move him along to try and break his spirit. That would only normally happen to AA cats, but they put Lee on what they called the circuit just to basically wind him in, even though he was only ever Cat B at worst. That's what got him his notoriety in the British prison system. I would have loved to have included Neil Booth, John Fale, Mark Hartley, John Black, Kevin Ducklin and Joe Livingston for this book, but a lot from Lee's generation politely declined. I know Lee and Neil were particularly close, and Neil has never forgotten Lee, and named his son Samuel Lee Booth, and his grandson is Frankie Lee Booth. I only knew of the other men mentioned, but being from Berwick Hills myself, I was very familiar with Joe, having worked for him several times. From my experience, Berwick Hills and Park End was a safer, cleaner place when Joe kept order there. He wouldn't allow those streets to become saturated with the drugs that, unfortunately, they are now. I know that when Lee's youngest daughter was shot in the eye with an air pellet gun, she was only 15 at the time, the Gazette reported that an anonymous businessman paid for her and her mother to have a season ticket each for Middlesbrough FC. That was Joe too. They all have new lives now. They're no longer Jack the Lads, but now respectable family men or businessmen, and some of them even have grandchildren. So their lives are completely opposite to what they were 30 years ago when they hung around with Middlesbrough's ultimate bad boy, and I've had to respect that, and although those people declined, I still think that I've managed to speak to some of the right people to answer my questions. One thing I didn't want to do was put Billy bullshitters in this book. I've met many people that say that he was their mate, when actually they maybe were just in the same pub at the same time back in 1988. When you read the chapters, I hope you conclude that I've got the right balance. I was told that if Lee Duffy was still here today, that he'd be the exact same person he was back in 1991. He didn't want to change, that he was happy being a gangster. He'd have only become bigger, stronger and deadlier. On the other hand, he might have been a more settled family man, popping out for a pint to his local on a Sunday afternoon, reminiscing about the crazy things he used to get up to and shaking his head. But we'll never know for sure. I spoke with officers from Cleveland Police, and although a lot of them have retired, they still can't speak of Lee Duffy, although they've agreed that a lot of the facts in this book are true, although I can't name the now retired officers. Even though Lee will have been gone 27 years by the time you read this, a handful of people in this book are still uncomfortable using their own names, so I agreed to change their names to protect their identity. Other than their names, the interviews remain 100% as they were told to me. Every chapter, I hope, although different to one another, will capture the full picture of who and what Lee Paul Duffy was about. Happy reading. And I hope you enjoy this book about the remarkable man he was either way. I've enjoyed researching the life of Lee Duffy. My overall opinion of him changed with every interview that I conducted. Now go, read 30 separate people's experiences and opinions of knowing Lee, and I'll see you for my summing up at the other end. Many thanks, always a pleasure. Jamie B. Lee Duffy was the type of person you could take to meet your grandmother on a Monday, then Millwall away on a Tuesday. Lee's close friend.